The auctioneer's hammer is already rising when the 7-year-old boy locks both hands around his mother's wrist and refuses, absolutely refuses, to let go. The crowd has already decided what happens next. The debts are real, the children are young, and no one in Caldwell Crossing believes a widow with 3 babies and empty pockets deserves anything more than a clean separation and a fresh start for someone else. But then a man no one expected steps out of the back of that crowd, and everything stops. Press like to support the channel, comment the name of the city you're watching in so I know how far this story has progressed, and remember to subscribe so you don't miss the next parts. The auction was set for 10 o'clock, but by 9:30 the crowd had already gathered along the main street of Caldwell Crossing, Kansas, the way people gather for things they know they shouldn't enjoy but can't bring themselves to miss. It was a Tuesday in late October, the sky the color of old pewter, the wind cutting in off the prairie with a particular meanness that October reserved for moments already short on mercy. Evelyn Mercer stood on the platform outside the county clerk's office with her 3 children pressed against her sides and did not look at the crowd. She had made herself a promise that morning while she braided Rose's hair by candlelight. She would not look at their faces. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her break. Noah stood on her left, 7 years old, small for his age, with his father's dark eyes and his father's stubborn jaw already set into something harder than a 7-year-old's jaw had any right to be. He had both hands wrapped around his mother's wrist, not her hand. Her wrist, as though he'd calculated that a wrist was harder to shake loose. Rose was 6, standing pressed into Evelyn's hip with her face turned away from the crowd and her fingers knotted in the fabric of her mother's coat. And Benjamin, Ben who had only turned 2 the month before, was balanced on Evelyn's opposite hip, heavy and warm, his face buried in her neck with the pure animal trust of a child who doesn't yet understand that the world can simply decide to take things away. The debt was $437. It had not been Evelyn's debt. That was the part that sat in her chest like a coal that wouldn't stop burning. The debt belonged to Thomas Mercer, her husband of 8 years, who had borrowed against the house and the wagon and apparently against a few other things she hadn't known about, and who had then had the profound inconsideration to die of a fever in September, leaving her with the debt, 3 children, no deed in her name, and a county administrator named Gerald Pratt, who had a smile that never quite reached his eyes, and a legal opinion that the estate, such as it was, must be liquidated to satisfy the creditors. She had tried to argue it. She had sat in Pratt's office for 3 separate appointments and laid out the case in terms she'd learned from watching Thomas handle business, calmly, with receipts, with dates. Pratt had listened with the expression of a man hearing something mildly interesting in a language he didn't particularly respect. "The law is the law, Mrs. Mercer," he'd said the 3rd time, folding her papers back toward her. "The assets must cover the liabilities. If you can raise the sum by the 15th, the proceeding is unnecessary. If you cannot," he'd shrugged in the way of men who have made their peace with other people's suffering. "Then we proceed." She had not been able to raise the sum. So here she was on the platform, with the sky gray overhead and the smell of horse and wood smoke hanging in the cold air, while Gerald Pratt stood to one side with his ledger and the auctioneer, a wide man named Crowell, who wore a red vest and seemed genuinely cheerful about the whole enterprise, called out figures to the crowd below. They'd started with the furniture, then the wagon, then the 2 milk cows. Then Crowell had looked at his list and looked at the crowd and said, in the same easy voice he'd used for the cows, that next up was the labor contract, a widow with domestic skills and 3 children of working age, the lot of them offered as indentured arrangement to settle remaining debt, terms negotiable, children to be placed per the preference of the acquiring party. That was when Noah's hands locked around her wrist. She felt it, felt the shift from the ordinary grip of a frightened child into something deliberate and final. She looked down at him without meaning to, forgetting her promise about not looking at faces. And what she saw on his face was not fear exactly. It was resolution. It was the expression of someone who had decided what they were willing to do. "Mama," he said quietly, so that only she could hear. "I know," she said. "I won't let go." "I know, baby." The bidding was not enthusiastic. There were a few men at the edge of the crowd. She didn't look at them directly, but she felt them, the way you feel a cold draft without seeing the gap in the wall. Men assessing the situation for what they could get out of it. A woman and children, debt satisfied, labor acquired. The practical mathematics of the frontier reduced to a transaction Crowell was moving through with the same brisk efficiency he'd applied to the milk cows. $40 was offered for Rose, $45 for Noah. A man near the back with a thick gray beard and a coat that had seen better decades offered $60 for Ben on the logic that a child that young could be raised to whatever purpose was needed. Evelyn listened to this with the coal in her chest burning hotter and her face arranged into stillness. She was shaking, but she'd been shaking since she woke up, and she'd decided shaking was permissible as long as her face didn't show it. She was calculating, because that was what she did. She'd always done it, even when Thomas was alive and everything was supposed to be his responsibility. She calculated how much had been offered, combined, whether the total approached the debt, whether there was any version of this where she could argue to the court that the figure satisfied the creditors and made the separation unnecessary. There wasn't. The numbers didn't work. They never worked. That was the trap. Going to 40 for the girl, Crowell was saying. Do I hear 45? I'll pay the debt. The voice came from the back of the crowd. It wasn't loud. It wasn't the voice of a man trying to be heard. It was simply a voice that expected to be heard, the kind of voice that had spent years in open country where volume didn't accomplish what steadiness could. The crowd shifted. People turned. The man who'd spoken was standing at the far edge of the gathering, near the corner of the feed store where the crowd thinned out. He was somewhere in his late 30s, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who work rather than perform work, with a dark canvas coat and a hat that had been rained on more than once. He wasn't particularly tall. He wasn't particularly anything, at first glance. He looked like half the men on the frontier, weathered and self-contained and about as readable as a fence post. But he'd said what he'd said. Crowell blinked. I beg your pardon? The debt. The man moved through the crowd without hurrying, and people got out of his way in the instinctive fashion that crowds make room for someone who has already decided where he's going. $437. I'll pay it. The whole amount. There was a silence that Evelyn would remember for the rest of her life, the particular quality of a crowd that has stopped knowing what it's supposed to do next. Gerald Pratt cleared his throat. Mr. Boone, in exchange for what? Crowell asked, because Crowell at least understood transactions. The man, Boone, had reached the foot of the platform now. He looked up at Evelyn, and for a moment she got a clear look at his face. It wasn't a comfortable face. There were lines in it that hadn't come from smiling, and his eyes were the flat gray-brown of creek water in winter, and there was nothing in his expression that offered easy reassurance. He wasn't performing kindness for the crowd. He wasn't performing anything. In exchange for the family stays together, he said, she works the ranch, earns wages. The children come with her. He looked at Pratt. You get your money. She keeps her kids. Write it up however you need to write it up. This is irregular, Pratt said. It's cash money. Boone reached into his coat and produced a leather pouch that landed on Pratt's ledger with a weight that made the administrator flinch slightly. Count it. The crowd made a sound that was not quite one thing or another. Not approval, not disapproval. Just the collective exhale of people who have been watching one story and have suddenly found themselves in a different one. Pratt opened the pouch and began to count. Evelyn looked down at Noah, whose hands were still locked around her wrist. You can let go, she said. He thought about it for a moment. Then, slowly, his grip loosened. Not all the way, just enough to become a normal hand holding hers, rather than a last resort. The man's name, as she learned over the next hour of signatures and official language, was Silas Boone. He owned a cattle ranch about 14 miles north of Caldwell Crossing, a place called the Broken Spur, which she later learned had been named by the previous owner, and that Silas had kept the name out of a lack of interest in renaming things rather than any attachment to it. He had no wife, no children, 2 ranch hands who had been with him for years, and a third he'd hired in the spring. The ranch was, by the county's accounting, one of the better managed operations in the territory. Not the largest, not the most profitable, but consistent, which on the frontier counted for more than either of those things. He said almost none of this to her himself. She assembled it from Pratt's references and the whispers at the edges of the crowd and a brief, stilted conversation with the clerk who processed the paperwork. What Silas Boone said to her directly, while Pratt was still counting and the crowd was still murmuring, was approximately 7 sentences. I need someone to keep the house and the books. My last housekeeper left in the spring, and I haven't replaced her. The house is in poor shape." "All right," she said. "The children are welcome. There's room." "Thank you." He looked at her for a moment as though checking whether she was going to add something, and when she didn't, he nodded once. "Can you be ready by morning? I'd like to start the drive back before the weather turns." She looked at him. She thought about the fact that everything she owned that had not been sold in the last 2 hours fit into 2 flour sacks and a carpet bag. "I can be ready in an hour," she said. Something moved briefly across his face that might have been surprise or might have been the wind. Then he turned back to Pratt, and she turned back to her children. The wagon ride to the Broken Spur took most of the following day. Silas drove. Evelyn sat in the back with the 3 children, surrounded by the remains of their possessions, watching Kansas unspool behind them in long, flat lengths of grass gone brown with the season. Noah sat close enough to her that their shoulders touched, but stared out the back of the wagon with a 7-year-old's complicated expression. Processing something, she knew, but not ready to put it into words yet. Rose fell asleep against Evelyn's arm around noon. Ben simply sat in her lap and looked at the sky. They stopped once, near midday, to water the horses at a creek crossing. Silas climbed down and saw to the animals and didn't say anything, and Evelyn got the children out to stretch their legs and then stood by herself at the edge of the creek for a moment and looked at the water. She was trying to take stock. She did this. She'd always done this, when things shifted under her in a way that threatened to knock her down. She made herself stand still and look at what was true. What was actually, factually true, stripped of everything that was fear or grief or the particular vertigo of having your life rearranged by circumstances you didn't choose. True. The children were with her. All 3. Noah's hands, Rose's fingers in her coat, Ben's weight on her hip. She had all of them. True. She had a place to go. It might be terrible. She didn't know yet. True. She owed this man something significant, and she had no idea yet what kind of person he was or what owing him would cost her. True. She was 31 years old, a widow with 3 children and $40 in debt experience and a set of skills she'd never had occasion to put to formal use, and she had survived this morning, and she would survive whatever came next because she had no choice, and because her children were counting on her, and those 2 facts, together, had always been enough. She heard a footstep behind her and turned. Silas was standing a few feet away, not looking at her but at the water. "They're good kids," he said. It was so unexpected that she didn't immediately respond. "They are," she said finally. "The boy." He paused. "He didn't cry, back there." "No." Noah hadn't cried. She had thought about that later, and it had broken her heart in a different way than the obvious things had. The idea that her 7-year-old had learned to hold that back, had learned that there were moments when crying was a luxury you couldn't afford. Silas looked at her then, briefly, and she saw again that his face didn't offer easy interpretation. "I'm not going to make this harder than it has to be," he said. "That's all I wanted to say." He walked back to the horses. She stood at the creek for another moment, then went to collect her children. The Broken Spur revealed itself around the last bend of a long dirt track as the light was going golden and the temperature had dropped sharply. It was, and she cataloged this with the dispassionate accuracy she applied to problems, not what she would have called a flourishing operation. The main house was solid enough, built from the kind of timber that suggested it had been constructed by someone who knew what they were doing, but the porch railing had a section missing and 2 of the windows had been patched with oilcloth rather than glass. And the kitchen garden, visible around the eastern side, had been abandoned late in the season and never properly put to bed. Dead vines still clinging to stakes, beds unturned. The barn was in better shape. Men, she had noticed in her 8 years of marriage, generally took better care of the things that held their horses than the things that held their families. 2 men came out of the barn when the wagon rolled in. Both were watching the wagon bed with expressions that Evelyn recognized. The careful blankness of people who have opinions they've decided to keep to themselves. For now. Silas introduced them without ceremony. The older one was Hector Vance, 40-something, built like a man made of leather straps pulled tight, with a gray-streaked mustache and eyes that missed very little. The younger was a kid named Danny, maybe 19, who had the eager quality of someone who hasn't yet had enough happen to him to settle him down. Mrs. Mercer will be taking over the house, Silas said to them, with the tone of a man announcing weather rather than asking for an opinion. And the books. Treat her accordingly. Hector's face did not change. Danny's did. A flicker of something that wasn't quite welcome and wasn't quite hostility, more like the adjustment of someone who has just been told that an arrangement they'd grown comfortable with is going to change. Yes, sir, Hector said. Silas looked at Evelyn. I'll show you the house. The house was worse inside than out. Not catastrophically. It wasn't a ruin, it was simply a place that had been inhabited by a man who did not notice domestic disorder because it did not interfere with the things he cared about. There were dishes that had been washed but stacked without system. There was a thick layer of dust on every flat surface. The floor in the kitchen had been swept sometime in the recent past, but the corners had been ignored for considerably longer. The pantry held staples: flour, salt, dried beans, cornmeal, a good supply of jerked beef, but they'd been stored in the random fashion of someone who acquired things as they ran out of them, rather than maintaining any system. The children stood in the center of the main room and looked around. Rose turned a slow circle, taking inventory in the deliberate way she did everything. Noah went immediately to the window and looked out at the barn. Ben sat down on the floor, toddled toward the fireplace, and had to be redirected by a hand on the back of his coat. There are 2 bedrooms upstairs, Silas said from the doorway. He didn't come in, she noticed. He stood in the frame like a man who wasn't sure of his welcome in his own house. You and the little one can take the larger. The older 2... The 3 children will share the larger room, she said. I'll take the smaller. He looked at her. That's the smaller bedroom. It's barely large enough for a bed. Then it's large enough. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked away. Suit yourself, he said. Supper. There's not much prepared. I'll see to it, she said. Give me an hour. She turned to the kitchen and began opening drawers to understand what she had to work with. Behind her, she heard him hesitate in the doorway for another moment, then move off toward the barn where he presumably felt more competent. Rose appeared at Evelyn's elbow. Mama, this place is dirty. I know. We're going to clean it? Yes. Rose considered this. Then, okay. And she moved to the nearest shelf and began, entirely without being asked, to take things down and stack them in an order that made sense to her 6-year-old logic, which turned out to be surprisingly practical. Evelyn felt something loosen in her chest, just slightly. Not relief. Relief was too large a word for it, just the particular sensation of a knot giving half a turn. She found a pot, found water, found enough dried beans and salt pork to make something that would pass for a meal, and got to work. Supper was the first test. She put it on the table at the right hour. Beans, cornbread cooked in the cast-iron skillet she'd found behind a larger pot, and the last of a dried apple she'd turned into something resembling a compote with a little sugar and cinnamon she'd located in the back of the pantry. It was not an elaborate meal, but it was a real one, and it was hot, which given the state of the kitchen was an accomplishment she didn't announce. Silas came in from the barn with Hector and Danny in the way that she would come to understand was his habit, eating with the hands rather than separately, which she supposed indicated something about the kind of employer he was, though she hadn't sorted out yet whether it was admirable or simply practical. They sat. She served the children first, then filled bowls for the men without waiting to be asked, which was perhaps presumptuous, but she needed to make clear, quietly and from the start, that she was not going to stand to one side and wait for permission to do the work she'd been brought here to do. Hector took a spoonful of the beans, chewed, looked at his bowl, took another spoonful, said nothing. Danny had the grace to look slightly surprised and then somewhat pleased, the expression of a 19-year-old who has been eating bachelor cooking for too long. Silas ate in silence, methodically, the way he seemed to do most things. Noah, seated across from Danny, was watching the ranch hand with the analytical focus of a boy trying to determine what kind of person this was. Danny noticed and looked back, and they had a moment of mutual assessment. You ride? Danny asked. No, Noah said. You want to learn? Noah looked at his mother. She looked back at him with the expression that meant she wasn't going to make this decision for him. Maybe, Noah said, with the elaborate casualness of a child trying not to want something too badly. I could teach you, Danny said. If your ma says it's all right. We'll see, Evelyn said, which satisfied no one completely and was intended to satisfy no one completely. She needed to understand this place before she started letting her children attach to things in it. After supper, while the children were getting ready for bed upstairs, Silas came to stand in the kitchen doorway again. He seemed to favor doorways, she was noticing, as a position that allowed him to engage without fully committing to being in a room. "The accounts," he said. "Yes?" "I haven't kept them as well as I should this quarter. There's a ledger on the desk in the front room. It's—" He paused. "I'm not good with the numbers." "I am," she said simply. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite name, not skepticism exactly, more like the careful examination of a man who has been told something is true and is deciding whether he believes it. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow, then." "Tomorrow," she agreed. He pushed off from the doorframe. She heard his footsteps cross the front room and go out the door, and then she was alone in the kitchen with the last of the dishes and the fire burning low and the sound of the wind coming in off the prairie through the gap in the window frame that needed weather stripping. She stood there for a moment with her hands braced against the edge of the sink, not doing anything, just letting the day land on her. All of it. The platform, and the crowd, and Crowell's red vest, and Noah's hands on her wrist, and the wagon, and the creek, and the drive, and this kitchen that smelled of old grease and needed 3 days of work before it would be what she needed it to be. She was not all right. She was not going to pretend she was all right. Thomas was 4 weeks dead, and she'd spent those 4 weeks fighting the law and losing, and today she'd stood on an auction block and her children had been priced while she watched. She was 31 years old and alone and in a stranger's house on the dark Kansas prairie, and she did not know if any of this was going to work. But the children were upstairs, together, all 3 of them, in the same room, with a roof over them, and a fire in the grate, and food in their stomachs. She straightened up, got back to the dishes. That was enough. That was what it had to be enough. In the days that followed, she found her footing the way you find your footing on uneven ground. Not all at once, not gracefully, but incrementally, and by paying attention to where the solid places were. The ledger was as bad as Silas had suggested, which meant it was actually worse, because men who describe their own record-keeping as poor are usually worse at it than they can see. The accounts had been kept in pencil, in a handwriting that started neat and got progressively worse as Silas apparently lost patience with the enterprise. And there were 3 months of entries where purchases had been noted without dates, which made reconciliation a particular puzzle. There were also 2 pages that appeared to record some kind of arrangement with a neighbor about shared fencing costs that had been partially honored and then abandoned, and the logic of which she had to reconstruct from context. She sat at the desk in the front room on the second morning and worked through it with the systematic patience she'd learned from watching her own father keep accounts. He'd been a mill owner in Ohio, precise and unromantic about numbers, and she'd spent her girlhood sitting beside him at the same kind of desk, watching the way figures either told the truth or they didn't. By late afternoon, she had a clear picture of where the broken spur stood, and she went to find Silas in the barn. He was replacing a buckle on a harness, seated on an overturned crate, working with the quiet concentration of someone who does this work well enough that it doesn't require them to think about it. "I've gone through the ledger," she said. He looked up. "And? You're profitable, more than you may realize. But you've been overpaying the supply merchant in town by about 9% because you're not tracking bulk discounts properly, and there's a fencing agreement with the Callaway Ranch that they owe you 2 days of labor on from last spring that you appear to have forgotten about." He set down the harness. "The Callaway arrangement? I thought that was settled." "It's not. I can show you the entries." She had the relevant pages in her hand. "And there's an arithmetic error in July that's been carrying through your totals and making your feed costs look higher than they are, which may be why you've been feeling tight in that line." He looked at her. She couldn't tell from his expression whether he was pleased or simply registering information. "How'd you learn to read accounts?" he said. "My father kept a mill. I used to do his books when I was 12. "Your husband—" Thomas didn't have a head for figures. She kept her voice neutral. "I handled ours as well. He had other skills." She handed him the pages. "You have a good operation. You're just not watching it carefully enough." He took the pages and looked at them for a long moment. She watched the process of a man absorbing information about himself that he hadn't fully known, the slight tension around the jaw, the deliberate way he turned to the second page. "The Calloway labor," he said finally. "I'll need to bring that up with Ray Calloway. He's not going to like being reminded." "That's his problem," she said. "It's 2 days of labor you're owed." Something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, more like the territory that smiles come from. "Fair point," he said. She turned to go back to the house. She had 3 hours before she needed to start supper, and there were still 4 months of ledger to reconcile. "Mrs. Mercer," she turned. He was looking at the pages still, not at her. "This is helpful," he said, in the tone of a man who is being careful with a word he doesn't use often. "That's why I'm here," she said, and went back to the house. The children settled in the way children settle, which was not smoothly or without protest, but with the pragmatic adaptability that Evelyn had always thought was one of the few unfair advantages children had over adults. Noah got his riding lesson. Danny took him out on the second afternoon on an old gray mare named Pockets, who was, Danny explained with great authority, the most patient animal on the property and probably in the county. Noah came back with hay in his hair and a grass stain on his knee, and an expression of concentrated satisfaction that Evelyn recognized as his version of joy. Rose attached herself to the kitchen garden project with a ferocity that surprised everyone, including Evelyn. On the third day, she found the girl with a trowel and a clear determination, turning over the neglected beds with the focus of someone who has identified a problem and has decided to solve it. "The ground is still good," Rose informed her mother seriously. "It just needs to be worked." Ben toddled after Hector with the alarming fearlessness of a 2-year-old who doesn't yet understand the concept of danger. And Hector, after 2 days of carefully redirecting the child away from hazards, had simply surrendered to the arrangement and taken to keeping one eye on him while he worked. Evelyn had watched from the kitchen window one afternoon as Hector lifted Ben onto a fence rail so he could see over into the corral, holding him there with one steady hand, and had felt something complicated and uncomfortable. Gratitude, she supposed, tangled with the awareness of how much her children were willing to attach to people. How quickly and how thoroughly, and how that willingness was both their best quality and the thing that most frightened her. She was careful with Silas. Not cold. She wasn't by nature cold, and coldness would have been both dishonest and counterproductive. But she kept her interactions functional. Work, logistics, the ranch. She asked what she needed to ask and answered what she needed to answer, and did not invite conversation that didn't have a clear purpose. Because she was 31 years old with 3 children in a strange man's house, and she needed to understand the landscape before she moved through it without looking where she was going. Silas seemed, if not comfortable with this arrangement, then at least accustomed to people who kept their own counsel. He was not a talkative man. He asked questions when he had them and didn't fill silences with noise. He ate what she cooked without commentary that she experienced as commentary, which, given the frontier, was more than she'd have expected. On the 5th evening, though, she came in from the kitchen garden. She'd gone out after supper to assess what Rose had uncovered and to plan what could realistically be planted for a late-season yield, and found Silas sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger and a pencil, frowning at it. "You're doing it wrong," she said, before she could stop herself. He looked up. "I'm trying to... The carry from September is in the wrong column. Here." She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. The first time she'd sat at the table with him without the children present. She turned the ledger so it faced her and showed him the error. "If you record it this way, it'll keep dropping into your totals incorrectly. You need to put it here." He watched what she was doing. He had good hands, she noticed. The hands of someone who works with them, scarred in the specific ways of the frontier, but dexterous. And he held a pencil differently than she'd have expected, lightly, as though he'd been taught to write by someone who cared about it. "My mother kept accounts," he said, out of nowhere. She looked up. "For my father's operation when I was young. She was good at it." He paused. "She died when I was 11. After that," he shrugged, "I did the best I could." It was the most he'd said about himself in the 5 days she'd been here. She considered it. "How old were you when you took over the ranch?" 22. I worked for other men until I had enough saved for the down." "By yourself?" "Mostly." He looked at the ledger. I did well enough, but the books. He shook his head. She turned the ledger back toward him. Show me how you'd record a purchase. He gave her a look that she couldn't quite place, somewhere between wary and resigned, and then picked up the pencil and made an entry. She watched, and then showed him where he was placing the decimal wrong, and they sat there for the better part of an hour, while she walked him through the logic of it, and he asked questions that were, she noticed, genuinely good questions. The questions of someone who thinks in a straight line and wants to understand why the system works the way it does rather than simply be told what to do. When they were done, she stood up and moved to get Ben's nightshirt from where she'd left it drying by the fire, and Silas said, Mrs. Mercer? Yes. I want you to know. He stopped, looked at the ledger, not at her. I don't regret what I did at the auction, if that's something you've been wondering about. She stood still for a moment. She had been wondering about it. She'd been wondering about it every day, in the way you can't stop examining the one piece of the foundation you're not sure about. What made you do it? She asked. She kept her voice even because she needed to know and she needed to hear it without the answer being shaped by her reaction. He was quiet for a moment. I saw the boy, he said, with his hands like that. And He stopped again, shook his head slowly. I don't know if I can explain it more than that. She looked at him. His face was closed in the way she'd learned was not deception, but simply the expression of a man who doesn't know how to make his interior world visible and has stopped trying. She thought about Noah's hands, the wrist grip, deliberate and final. Thank you, she said. It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough, but it was true, which was what she could give him right now. He nodded once, still looking at the ledger. She took Ben's nightshirt and went upstairs to put her children to bed. The wind was picking up outside, rattling the oilcloth in the east window, and somewhere off across the prairie she could hear the first sound of weather coming. She got all three children settled and sat on the edge of the bed in the narrow room that was hers, in the dark, listening to the wind build, and did not try to name what she was feeling because she suspected it was too many things at once to be named. She was here. Her children were here. The roof was solid. The accounts were in order. That was enough. She kept telling herself that. She almost believed it. The storm she'd heard building that first night arrived properly on the sixth day, and it arrived without apology. She was in the kitchen at 4:30 in the morning when the first real gust hit the house. Not a warning sound, but the full thing. A wall of wind that made the timbers groan and sent something off the porch skittering across the yard. She was already dressed because she'd been lying awake listening to it build for 2 hours, doing the math in her head the way she always did when she couldn't sleep. What was secured, what wasn't, what mattered most if it came to choosing. She got the fire stoked and put water on, and then went to the window and looked out at a darkness that was moving. The grass was flat in one direction, then another. The barn lantern, which Hector always left burning low, was swinging on its hook and throwing light in arcs that made the yard look different every few seconds. She heard boots on the stairs and turned. Silas came through the kitchen door already pulling on his coat, hat in hand, and he stopped when he saw her standing at the window. You're up, he said. The roof on the south side of the barn, she said. I noticed 2 days ago there's a section where the nails are working loose. If the wind gets under it, I know about it. He was moving toward the back door. I've been meaning to get to it. Meaning to and getting to were two different things, and they both knew it, but she didn't say that. She said, What do you need? He stopped with his hand on the door latch, turned and looked at her. You don't need to. The barn is where the horses are, she said. The horses are the ranch. What do you need? There was a pause. She'd noticed he did that when he was recalculating something. And then he said, Wake Hector. Tell him to bring the spare timber from the equipment shed, the short planks. Danny can hold the ladder. All right. She was already moving. What followed was 3 hours of the most unpleasant work she'd done in recent memory, which was saying something given the last 6 days of scrubbing the kitchen. The wind was not the howling theatrical thing of stories. It was low and insistent and cold enough to make her eyes water, and her fingers clumsy inside her gloves, and it pushed against everything she tried to do with the particular stubbornness of a force that has no interest in human inconvenience. She ran lines from the house to the barn, held things while Hector hammered, kept Danny from being blown off the ladder twice by the simple method of grabbing his belt, and at one point spent 15 minutes in the dark using her body weight to hold a board flat against the barn roof, while Silas drove nails into it with the focus of a man who is operating entirely on the knowledge that if he stops, something gets worse. When the wind finally eased around 7 in the morning, they stood in the barn doorway looking at the yard. A section of the porch railing that had already been loose was down in the grass 40 feet from the house. One of Rose's garden stakes had become a projectile and was buried tip first in the side of the water trough. A bucket had vanished entirely and would turn up 3 days later in the north pasture. The barn roof, though, was whole. Hector looked at the roof, then at Silas, then at Evelyn. His expression was neutral in the way of a man keeping his opinion orderly until he sorted it out. "Coffee," Evelyn said and went inside to make it. She heard Silas behind her, stomping mud off his boots on the step, and then the lower rumble of him and Hector exchanging something in the shorthand of men who've worked together long enough that full sentences aren't always required. She didn't try to hear it. She got the coffee going and stood at the stove with her hands spread over the heat until the feeling came back into her fingers. Noah appeared at the top of the stairs, hair wild, and looked down at her. "Was that a tornado?" "No." It sounded like a tornado. "It was wind. Come down and eat." He came down and Rose behind him, and then Ben toddling after with his nightshirt untucked and his face creased from sleep, and the kitchen filled with the ordinary chaos of morning, and Evelyn moved through it the way she always did. Making food, answering questions, redirecting Ben away from the fire with one hand while turning cornmeal with the other. And gradually the storm became something that had happened rather than something happening, which was, she'd found, how most bad things eventually arrange themselves. Silas came in while she was serving. He sat down at the table and drank his coffee and looked at his hands, which had a cut across the left palm from something she hadn't seen happen. She noticed it when she set his bowl down. "That needs cleaning," she said. "It's fine." "It's not fine. It needs cleaning or it'll go bad." She said it flatly, the way she said things to Noah when he was doing the 7-year-old version of pretending not to be hurt. She went to the shelf where she'd reorganized the medical supplies on her second day and came back with what she needed. He looked at the supplies, then at her. "You know what you're doing with that?" "My mother had 5 children. I know what I'm doing." She sat down across from him, which put them knee to knee around the corner of the table, closer than they'd been. And she took his hand and began cleaning the cut with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone for whom physical proximity in the service of practical necessity is simply not a thing she has time to be awkward about. He held still. She worked. The children ate. Outside, the wind had dropped to something almost ordinary. "Mrs. Mercer," he said after a moment. "Evelyn," she said, if you're going to let me clean your hand, you can use my name." There was a pause. "Evelyn," he said. The word had a slightly tentative quality, like a man testing the weight of something before committing to it. "The board, the one you were holding, that was a 2-man job. You held it like you'd done it before." "I've done harder things than hold a board." "I believe you." She tied off the bandage and released his hand and looked up. He was watching her with that creek water gaze, flat and still and harder to read than it should have been at this distance. "Thank you," he said. And this time it didn't have the careful quality of obligation. It was just the word, plainly meant. She stood up. "Eat your breakfast," she said. "The Callaway fence line won't wait." Hector warmed to her slowly, the way certain materials warm, not quickly and not with any visible enthusiasm, but thoroughly, once the process got going. The thing that started it, she thought, was the accounts. She'd discovered, going through the September entries, that Silas had been quietly advancing Hector $3 a month against wages that had been docked by a previous arrangement Hector had with a creditor she'd never heard of, and that this advance was being tracked in the ledger in a way that didn't accurately reflect how much had already been repaid. When she brought it to Silas, he'd looked at the figures and then at her. "He's been overpaying for 6 months," she said. "He's actually ahead of what he owes." "Are you sure?" "I've checked it 4 times. Silas had gone quiet, and she'd understood from his silence that he hadn't known. He'd lost track of it, the way the decimal kept slipping because he hadn't learned how to hold these things in the right columns. He wasn't cheating Hector. He simply hadn't been watching closely enough to notice. She'd recalculated it properly and given the corrected figures to Silas. And 2 days later, Hector had appeared in the kitchen doorway while she was working and stood there for a moment in his characteristic stance of a man not quite sure how to begin. "Silas says you found the error in my wage account," he said. "I found several errors," she said. "That one was important to correct." Hector was quiet for a moment. "My wife. We're saving for her passage out from Missouri. The money matters." She hadn't known he had a wife. Silas hadn't mentioned it. "Your wife's in Missouri?" "Kansas City. 3 years I've been working toward bringing her out." He paused. "I'm 6 months closer than I thought I was." She looked at him. He had the expression of a man who doesn't know how to thank a woman he'd been reserving judgment about. "Good," she said simply, and turned back to her work, because making it easy for him was the kind of thing that mattered. After that, Hector was different. Not effusive, he wasn't built for effusive, but his eyes, when they passed her in the yard, didn't have the measuring quality anymore. He started bringing in firewood without being asked. He fixed the section of porch railing without anyone mentioning it. Small adjustments, not gestures, which she respected more than gestures. Danny was easier and more complicated at the same time. He was 19 and he liked things to be clear, and she understood that his initial wariness had been partly about Noah, about what it meant to have a child on the property who wanted to ride, who would need teaching, who would have opinions about the horses. Danny's relationship with the horses was the center of his self-conception, she'd observed, and the possibility of sharing that territory was both appealing and threatening to him in the way of someone who hasn't yet figured out that generosity doesn't reduce what you have. He figured it out through Noah, mostly. Noah was a relentless student. He watched how Danny moved around the horses and imitated it with the unsettling accuracy of a child who observes without the self-consciousness that makes adults imitate badly. He asked questions that were sometimes obvious and sometimes startlingly not obvious at all. The second week, he asked why the gray mare favored her left shoulder on uphill ground, which was a question that Hector, who'd been watching from the fence, told Evelyn later that evening was the kind of question that took most grown men a year to think to ask. Danny didn't know the answer. He went and looked and found that there was a small stone bruise that had been developing for a while, that nobody had caught. And he treated it, and afterward he looked at Noah with a different expression. Still the 19-year-old's quality of not wanting to seem impressed, but underneath it a kind of recalibration. "Your kid's got an eye, was he?" told Evelyn one evening. "I know," she said. "You teach him that, looking at the horses that way?" "I didn't teach him anything about horses. He learned it watching you." Danny went away from that conversation appearing to find something uncomfortable about it, which she suspected meant he was processing a form of pride that he didn't have a category for yet. The weeks settled into a shape. She learned the ranch the way she'd learned to keep accounts, systematically, from the foundation up, resisting the urge to understand everything at once. The north pasture flooded in sustained rain and needed a drainage channel that she flagged to Silas with a sketch she'd made from walking the property line. The water supply from the well was reliable in most weather, but had a tendency to carry silt after heavy rain, which meant the horses needed an alternate source she identified as the East Creek, accessible by a route she mapped. The supply arrangement with the merchant in Caldwell Crossing had 3 inefficiencies she corrected in a single letter that she drafted and showed to Silas before sending, because it was his operation, and she didn't act unilaterally on things that were his to decide. He read the letter, made one small change to the tone of a single sentence, softer, she noted, than she'd written it, which was interesting, and told her to send it. The merchant's response came the following week and was, if not enthusiastic, at least accommodating. She filed it in the correspondence folder she'd created because there hadn't been one. She was also, during this time, trying to understand Silas Boone in the way that you try to understand a landscape you're going to have to navigate regularly. Not intimately, not yet, but practically. What were the solid places? What were the soft ones? Where could you put your weight? He was not an easy man to understand. He wasn't concealed exactly. He didn't actively hide himself, but he had the quality of someone who had spent a long time alone and had organized his interior life in ways that didn't leave obvious entry points. He worked harder than either of his hands, which they both knew and which created a particular dynamic of respect that was different from the respect of authority. He had opinions he didn't volunteer. He made decisions without announcing them and then acted on them quietly, which was sometimes efficient and sometimes, she suspected, cost him because people didn't know the decision had been made until they ran into it. She started noticing things. The way he adjusted the schedule after a cold night without being asked, giving the horses an extra hour before working them. The way he spoke to the cattle, not the sentimental cooing of a man who'd romanticized the animals, but short, direct sounds that were more about rhythm than language, and that seemed to communicate something real because the cattle responded to him differently than to the others. The book on his nightstand, she'd seen it through the open door on her way past. A collection of territorial surveys and geological reports, the kind of reading that most men would consider work rather than evening material. She filed all of this without deciding what to do with it, because she didn't know yet what it meant. What she did know was that he watched her work the way she watched him, not obtrusively, not in a way she could have called him on, but steadily and with the same systematic quality she applied to everything she observed. She was being assessed. She'd understood that from the first day. She didn't resent it because she was doing the same thing to him, and because the assessment was fair. They were two people trying to determine whether an arrangement they'd entered into under unusual circumstances was going to work, and the only honest way to do that was to watch. The stallion came into the story on a Thursday, late in the third week. His name was Cannon. She learned this afterward, and he belonged to a rancher named Addison, who was transporting him through the territory to a buyer 2 counties east. The arrangement had been made for Cannon to spend one night in the Broken Spur barn while Addison rested in town, which was a simple transaction that should have been unremarkable. Cannon was not interested in being unremarkable. She didn't see how it had started. She was in the kitchen with Rose, working on the bread that Rose had decided she was going to learn to make because Rose had decided something, and then Rose did it. When she heard Danny shouting from the direction of the barn, not the ordinary shouting of ranch work, but the particular sharp quality of a shout that means something is wrong with the animal. She came out of the kitchen into the yard and took in the situation in pieces. The barn door open and swinging, Hector pressed against the fence with his arms spread to keep it from getting past him, Danny on the ground 20 feet from the barn door, moving but not up yet, and Cannon in the open yard. 16 hands of furious dark horse, eyes white at the edges, moving in the chaotic pattern of an animal that has decided the space around it is a threat. She did not see Noah. That was the thing that hit her. Not the horse, not the situation, but the absence of Noah, who had been in the barn an hour ago working with Danny on the gray mare, and who was not visible in the yard, and who was 7 years old and not much bigger than the barn door. She moved toward the barn at an angle, not directly, not fast enough to escalate the horse's agitation, but steadily, and she heard Silas's voice from the other side of the yard, sharp and controlled. "Evelyn, stop." She stopped, not because he told her to, but because she'd seen what he'd seen. Cannon had registered her movement and swung his head toward her, and a horse in that state of agitation that locks onto something is about to do something. She held still. Cannon was moving in her direction, not charging, not yet, but orienting, the way an animal does when it's narrowed its attention to one point. "Noah's in the back stall," Silas said, still in that controlled voice. He was moving along the fence line in the slow, deliberate way of someone who knows horses. "He's all right. He stayed put." The relief was so sharp it was almost painful, and she shoved it aside because she needed to think, not feel. Cannon had stopped about 30 feet from her. He was breathing hard, nostrils wide, still wide-eyed, and she understood that the open yard and the strange smells and whatever had set him off in the barn had worked him into a state that wasn't about any of them individually. It was about everything, the accumulated alarm of an animal pushed past what it could process. She knew horses, not the way Danny knew them, not the technical expertise of someone trained for it, but she'd grown up with a neighbor who kept a difficult mare, and she'd learned what she'd learned by necessity and observation. What she knew was this: the thing that escalated a horse in this state was movement that seemed like threat, and the thing that sometimes didn't was stillness and sound. She started talking, not to the horse exactly, or not only to the horse. She said her own name, then Rose's name, then Noah's, then Ben's, in the quiet, even tone she used at night when one of the children had a bad dream and she needed to re-anchor them to what was real. She didn't move. She kept her hands open at her sides. Cannon swung his head. One ear came toward her. Behind her, she could hear Silas moving. She couldn't see him. She didn't look. And she trusted him to be doing what he knew how to do, the way she trusted Hector to have sense and Danny to get himself up off the ground and get clear. She kept talking. The horse's breathing slowed, fractionally. The ears moved. Silas came in from Cannon's left side with a rope, and the horse felt it before it landed and launched sideways, but he was already reading the movement and he went with it rather than against it, the way you handle something that size by letting it take the direction and just staying attached. And after 3 minutes of what looked like barely controlled chaos, Cannon was standing with his head down and his sides heaving, and Silas had the rope secure and the situation was over. Danny limped into view from behind the trough. He had a gash on his chin, and he was going to have a spectacular bruise along his ribs, but he was upright, and his eyes were clear. "He came off the stall wall," he said, by way of explanation. "I don't know what—" "Something spooked him," Silas said. He was running a hand down Cannon's neck. "Check the back of his stall. There might be something in there that got in." There was, as it turned out. A rat had gotten into the hay, and Cannon had smelled it, and the combination of the smell and the close quarters had been enough. These things happened. Silas said this to Danny without condemnation, which was, she noticed, the way he delivered most corrections. Factually, without the extra weight of blame that didn't change anything. Noah came out of the back stall with hay in his hair and a carefully neutral expression that did not fool his mother for a single second. She crossed to him and crouched down and put her hands on his shoulders and looked at him. He was 7 years old and he'd done the right thing. Stayed put. Stayed clear. And she could see in his face the effort it had cost him, staying still when everything in him wanted to move. "You did good," she said. His jaw was set. "I was scared," he said, in the tone of a child confessing something. "I know. You did good anyway." He thought about this. Then, "You were talking to the horse." "Yes." "Did it work?" "It helped." She stood up. Mr. Silas did the actual work. Silas was watching them from across the yard with Cannon's rope still in his hand, and he had an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something she would have described, if she'd had to put words to it, as a kind of careful attention that wasn't assessment anymore. It was something else. She didn't name it. "Let's get Danny's chin seen to," she said, and they all moved back toward the house. Chad. October gave way to November, and the cold became real. Not the theatrical cold of a bad night, but the sustained, indifferent cold of a prairie winter settling in for the long work of the season. She went through the house with a different eye once the temperature dropped, identifying where the heat was escaping and what needed to be done about it, and she made a list and gave it to Silas not as a demand but as information, because in her experience the difference between those two things was everything. He looked at the list and said, "Some of this I can do this week. The window glass. I'll need to order it." "I know. I already sent the order with the supply letter." He looked up from the list. "You knew I'd agree to it?" "I knew the window needed glass," she said. "The rest was up to you." He made a sound that might, in a different man, have been a laugh. "Fair enough," he said. The children adjusted to winter the way children adjust to most things, by finding out what was interesting about it. Rose discovered that the kitchen was warmest in the mornings and staged a systematic occupation of the corner nearest the stove, from which she conducted her various projects with the territorial focus of someone who knows a good position when they find it. Noah found that Hector knew things about tracking in snow, and attached himself to this knowledge with the single-mindedness he brought to everything that interested him. Ben mostly wanted to touch the frost on the windows, which was a battle Evelyn stopped fighting on day 3 of the cold and instead redirected into a pattern game, pointing to the shapes and naming them, watching his face as he learned a word for each. It was during one of these sessions, in the front room one evening while Silas worked at the desk nearby, that Ben pointed at Silas and said, clearly and with the absolute certainty of a 2-year-old who has decided something, "Sigh." Evelyn looked up. Silas had gone still at the desk. Ben pointed at him again. "Sigh," he repeated, with the triumphant air of a child who has just solved something. There was a pause, then Silas said, without looking up from his papers, in a voice that was carefully ordinary, "Hey, Ben." Ben beamed. He had no use for longer conversations yet. The word was enough, the acknowledgement was enough, and he went back to the frost pattern on the window with satisfied completeness. Evelyn looked at the side of Silas's face. He'd gone back to his papers, but something in the set of his shoulders was different. She looked away before he could notice her looking. Ticked. The thing she hadn't prepared for was the gossip. She'd known it was coming. She wasn't naive about frontier society, which had a particular relationship to propriety and a particular interest in irregularity, and a widow living in a single man's house, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of the fact that the arrangement had been born from necessity and was entirely practical, was an irregularity. It arrived in the form of a woman named Clara Finch, who drove out from Caldwell Crossing on a Wednesday in mid-November with a basket of preserves and a smile that was slightly too warm for the amount of previous acquaintance they had, which was none. She sat at the kitchen table and accepted coffee and talked about the winter and the state of the road, and then, with the smooth inevitability of a woman who has planned this part of the conversation, said, "I imagine it must be strange for you, Mrs. Mercer, being so isolated out here with Mr. Boone." "It's a working arrangement," Evelyn said. She kept her tone pleasantly factual. "I manage the house and the accounts. He runs the cattle. It's practical." "Of course." Clara's smile didn't change. "Still, people do talk. And you with 3 little ones, I only wonder whether you've thought about how it looks." "To whom?" Evelyn asked. "To the community." Clara set down her cup. "There are those who feel that Mr. Boone has perhaps acted rashly, that he's taken on a responsibility that isn't his to bear, and that the situation, while perhaps well-intentioned, sends a message about—" "About what?" Noah's voice came from the doorway. He was standing there in his coat, just come in from outside, and he had the expression of someone who has been listening for longer than they've been visible. Clara looked at him with the slight adjustment of an adult recalibrating for an audience they hadn't accounted for. "Noah," Evelyn said, "go find Danny." "I don't want to find Danny." He was looking at Clara with the flat, unwavering focus he'd had on that auction platform. "She's talking about us." "Noah." He held Clara's gaze for a moment, and Clara, Evelyn noticed, was the first one to look away. Then he turned and went back out the door, pulling it shut with the careful quietness of a child who knows that slamming it would be wrong and wants to anyway. Evelyn looked at Clara. She let the silence sit for a moment, not to be dramatic, but because she needed the moment to make sure what she said next came out the way she meant it, rather than the way she felt. "Mrs. Finch," she said, "I'm going to tell you the same thing I would tell anyone who came here with the same concern. I was on an auction platform in this county 4 weeks ago. My children were going to be separated and sold as labor contracts. Mr. Boone stopped that. We are here because that is the alternative to what was happening to us." She picked up her coffee cup. "I'm not ashamed of this arrangement. I'm not going to pretend to be ashamed of it for the convenience of people who didn't offer any other options. If the community wants to have a different opinion of my situation, the community is welcome to have offered the $437 themselves." Clara opened her mouth and closed it. "Finish your coffee," Evelyn said pleasantly. "The preserves look lovely." Clara finished her coffee and left 15 minutes later with the slightly abbreviated manner of a woman who came to deliver a message and has been handed something heavier than she expected to carry home. Silas appeared in the kitchen doorway that evening. His doorway. Always his doorway. And she knew from his expression that he'd heard about Clara Finch, probably from Hector, who'd probably heard it from Danny, who'd been somewhere he shouldn't. "You didn't have to," he started. "I know I didn't have to," she said. "I wanted to." She looked at him. "Is there something you wanted to tell me? About how you'd like me to handle it differently?" He considered this. "No," he said after a moment. "Good," she said. He stayed in the doorway a moment longer than necessary, which was either habit or something else. Then he moved off, and she heard the front door close, and she went back to the stove. What she didn't account for, what she perhaps should have and hadn't, was the way proximity worked on her. Not in the dramatic way of stories, not with the obvious machinery of attraction that announced itself. More quietly than that, more inconveniently. It was the small things that accumulated. The way he knew by the 3rd week that she drank her coffee without sugar and left it on the stove edge at the right temperature without being asked. The way he'd taken to leaving the territorial survey reports on the desk in the front room on the evenings when she mentioned she wanted to understand the north property line better, without commenting on it. The way he'd listened when she'd told him, in a moment she hadn't planned, about Thomas. Not about the debt, but about who Thomas had been, the good of him, the way he'd made her laugh at the wrong moments, and the way he'd loved the children, clumsy and wholehearted. And Silas had listened without offering anything in return, and without offering meaningless comfort, just sat with it, and she'd found that the listening was the right thing, that it was what she'd needed. She was not ready to call it anything. She was 31 years old with 3 children and the memory of loss still close enough that touching it hurt. And she was also practical, and practical meant not naming things before you were sure of what you were looking at. But she knew that something had shifted, and she knew that Silas knew it too, because she'd caught him watching her sometimes in a way that was different from the early assessment, different from the professional attention of an employer watching an employee. She didn't pursue it. Neither did he. They were both, she thought, people who had learned that patience was a form of protection, and they extended it to each other in the complicated courtesy of 2 people who were sharing space and both trying very hard not to be careless. November moved toward its end, and the prairie went brown and gray under skies that held their light for fewer hours each day, and the broken spur settled into winter, and the 4 of them, 5 with Danny and 6 with Hector, went about the work of keeping things going with the particular intimacy of people who share weather and circumstance long enough that the distance between strangers starts to close, whether they intended it to or not. On a Sunday evening near the end of the month, she was banking the kitchen fire for the night when she heard a sound from the front room, quiet, not alarming, but there. She went to the doorway and found Silas in the chair by the window with Ben asleep in his arms. Ben had apparently gotten out of bed and come downstairs in the dark, which he did sometimes, and found Silas there, and had simply climbed up, as 2-year-olds do, with the categorical confidence of a child who has decided where he wants to be. Silas was looking out the dark window. He hadn't heard her. He was very still in the way of a man trying not to disturb something fragile, and one hand was resting on Ben's back, barely touching. She stood in the doorway for a moment and did not say anything. Then she went quietly back to the kitchen and finished with the fire. The cold outside pressed against the windows. The ranch was quiet. Ben slept. Some things, she thought, don't need to be named to be real. December came in cold and stayed cold, and the ranch moved through the early weeks of winter with the disciplined rhythm that hard seasons demand from people who intend to come out the other side of them. She had been at the Broken Spur for 6 weeks when Hector's wife arrived. Margaret Vance came by stage from Kansas City on a Thursday morning, and Hector drove the wagon to Caldwell Crossing to collect her with a quietness about him that was different from his ordinary quietness, tighter, more careful, the way a man gets when something matters so much that he's afraid to let it show. He'd been saving for 3 years. He told Evelyn this once, without elaboration, and she'd understood from the way he said it that 3 years was a long time to hold something in your head as a destination. She made sure the bunkhouse was clean before he left. She didn't announce she'd done it. She just did it, the way she did most things that needed doing. And when Hector came back that afternoon with Margaret beside him on the wagon seat, he looked at Evelyn across the yard with an expression that said he knew and that it mattered, and that he wasn't going to make a production of saying so. Margaret Vance was a small, direct woman in her mid-40s with gray threading through her dark hair and the particular quality of someone who has spent a long time managing circumstances that didn't ask her permission. She took one look at Evelyn and said, "You're the one who sorted out the accounts." "Yes," Evelyn said. "Good," Margaret said, as though this resolved something. And they shook hands, and that was the beginning of a friendship that was less about warmth than about 2 women recognizing in each other the particular species of person who gets things done and doesn't expect to be thanked for it. Margaret moved into the bunkhouse with Hector and was immediately useful in the way of someone who has been waiting for an outlet. She knew about cattle, more than she'd ever been asked to demonstrate in Kansas City, and within a week she'd identified a respiratory issue in 2 of the younger steers that Hector had been watching with the uncertain eyes of a man who suspects something is wrong but can't name it. Margaret named it, prescribed a treatment she'd learned from a rancher's wife in Missouri, and proved correct, which established her authority on the subject with a completeness that precluded debate. Silas accepted this development with the same equanimity he brought to most things he hadn't anticipated. He looked at the situation, recalibrated, and moved forward. He told Evelyn one evening that he thought it was good having Margaret there. Hector works better, he said, which was his version of saying that a man who has been worried about something for 3 years and has now stopped worrying can give his full attention to the work. Yes, Evelyn said. He was quiet for a moment. They were at the table going over the December supply order, and the fire was down to coals, and outside the temperature had dropped below what it had been even a week ago. You knew she was coming, he said. Hector told me about her, yes. You cleaned the bunkhouse. She looked at him. It needed cleaning. He held her gaze for a beat, and then looked back at the supply list, and something in the line of his mouth was not quite a smile, but occupied the same region. She had stopped trying to decide whether to find that interesting. The prairie fire started on a Wednesday in late January. She saw the smoke first, a thin brownish column rising south-southeast, maybe 3 miles out, that she noticed while hanging the morning's washing on the line, and that made her stop with a shirt half pinned and look because it had the wrong color and the wrong shape for a controlled burn. Controlled burns lay flat and dissipate. This smoke was rising and building. She left the washing and went to find Silas. He was in the barn and he'd already seen it. He was standing in the doorway looking south when she came around the corner, and his face had the particular closed quality that meant he was calculating rather than reacting, which was, she'd learned, a good sign. Men who reacted in the first 30 seconds of a fire emergency made the next hour harder for everyone. How far? She said. 3 miles, maybe less. Wind's out of the south-southwest. He turned to her. It'll move. She understood what that meant. The wind was behind the fire. A fire with a south-southwest wind in open prairie country moved the way water moved downhill. Not dramatically, not in the way of stories, but with the absolute patience of something that doesn't have to hurry because it has all the fuel it needs. How fast? She said. Depends on the grass. It's dry. He paused. 3 hours. Maybe 4 if we're lucky. She looked at the smoke. She thought about the children. I can take the children to the Calloway Ranch, she said. It's northeast, away from the wind line. Rose can manage Noah and Ben on the wagon. Rose is 6, he said. I know how old Rose is. She can manage them on the wagon if she knows what she's doing, and she'll know what she's doing because I'll tell her. She looked at him. I'm not leaving. His expression shifted. Not dramatically, but she'd learned to read the small movements. Evelyn, 3 hands and you against a prairie fire is not enough. You know that. She said it flatly, not as an argument, but as arithmetic. I can handle a fire break line. I know how to use a shovel. Margaret can help with the wet lines on the structure. She met his eyes. Tell me I'm wrong about the arithmetic. He looked at her for a long moment. The smoke behind him was broader now, she could see, the column feeding itself from something it had found. The children go first, he said. The children go first, she agreed. He turned back to the barn and raised his voice, and Hector appeared from the far stall at a pace that said he'd also already seen the smoke. Getting the children onto the wagon took 12 minutes. She knew, because she counted, in the compressed way time works when speed matters and panic is a luxury you can't afford. She dressed Ben first because he was the least able to help the process, then Rose, then Noah, who tried to argue. I want to stay, he said. He was standing in the center of the bedroom with his coat half on and his jaw set in the way she'd learned meant he'd already committed to the position and was going to require actual reasoning to move. No, she said. I could help. Noah? She went down to his level, which she didn't always do when time was short, but she did it now because his face needed it. I need you to do a job. It's a harder job than staying here. He waited. I need you to get Rose and Ben to the Calloway Ranch without stopping and without going off the track and without letting either of them know how scared you are. Because they're going to be scared, and if you're scared too, all 3 of you will be. She held his gaze. Can you do that? He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw didn't relax. He wasn't old enough yet for resolve and fear to coexist without tension, but something in his eyes settled. Yes, he said. The Calloways know you're coming. I'm sending you to Margaret first. Margaret, who had said she would go with the children to the Calloway Ranch because her presence would calm them, and because she was one less body on the fire line, which was a decision Evelyn had not asked her to make and was grateful for anyway. She walked them to the wagon and she kissed all three of them. Ben twice because he was two and because she needed it even if he didn't. And she looked at Noah one more time on the wagon seat, and he looked back at her with his father's eyes and his father's jaw, and something that was entirely his own, some quality she didn't have a name for but recognized as the thing in him that would carry him through whatever the world decided to hand him. "Go," she said. He clicked at the horse, and the wagon moved. She stood and watched it long enough to be sure the direction was right, and then she turned and went to find Silas. The fire line they chose was half a mile south of the barn, far enough out to give them working room, close enough that if they failed to hold it, there was still time to pull back and try the closer perimeter. Silas made this decision quickly, with the confidence of someone who had done this before, and she was grateful for the speed because second-guessing the position was the kind of thing that cost time that the fire was not going to give them. The work was simple in concept and brutal in practice. Fire breaks are made by removing fuel. You dig out the dry grass, clear the ground down to bare earth, create a width of nothing that the fire can't cross. The width has to be enough. If it isn't enough, you do it again further back, and you hope the second line holds what the first one didn't. Silas and Danny took the eastern section. Hector took the western approach. Evelyn worked the center with a spade she'd found in the equipment shed, one she'd never used before, with a slightly short handle that meant she had to work with a lower swing than was comfortable. She made this adjustment without spending time on it and settled into the rhythm. Swing, dig, lift, turn, back. And she kept going. The smoke thickened as the morning progressed. She couldn't see the fire yet, just the smoke, and this was both better and worse than seeing it. Better because a visible fire gives you something to orient to. Worse because smoke without fire meant the fire was still somewhere behind its own opacity, coming at a rate she couldn't assess. She heard Silas call out from her right. "How are you doing?" She looked up. She had worked 40 feet of her section. Her shoulders were burning, and there was a blister opening on her right palm through the glove. "Fine," she called back. A pause. "Evelyn?" I said, "I'm fine. How's your section?" "2/3. She put her head down and kept digging. At some point, she couldn't have said when because time had become the distance between this shovelful and the next. She became aware that the light had changed. Not the quality of it, but the direction. She straightened and looked south and saw it. The fire was visible now. It wasn't close yet. It was still a long way out, a dark boiling line moving through the grass with the orange underneath it, coming and going as the wind worked through the fuel, but it had size. It was not a manageable thing that was getting ahead of a control burn. It was a fire that had been feeding for hours and had organized itself into something with weight and momentum. She stood and looked at it for approximately 3 seconds, which was all she allowed herself, and then went back to digging. Hector appeared at her left elbow. "I've got my section. I'll help finish yours." She moved aside to give him room, and they worked side by side in silence, and the rhythm doubled and the section came together faster. She could hear Danny and Silas working, could track their progress by the sound, the steady percussive thud of shovel on hard ground that was the only sound that mattered. When the break was finished, 220 feet of scraped earth, 4 feet wide in most places and 3 in the narrowest section. Silas walked the line with his hat in his hand, looking at it with the expression of a man who is making himself see it honestly rather than optimistically. 3 feet is not enough in the narrow section, he said. "I know," Evelyn said. "We widened it as far as we could before the rock shelf." "I know." He put his hat back on. "We wet it down now. Everything we can carry." They wet it down. She and Danny ran bucket lines from the water trough in the East Creek, and they soaked the break and soaked the ground on the near side, their side, as far out as they could get, because wet ground doesn't carry fire the way dry ground does. This was less scientific than it was desperate, but desperation applied systematically was better than nothing. The fire reached the south edge of the break at noon. She had expected it to feel like something, some dramatic encounter, the confrontation that the morning had been building toward. What it actually felt like was noise and heat and the absolute requirement to keep moving. The fire came to the break, and it did what fire does with an obstacle. It found the edges, it tested the width, it threw sparks ahead of itself in the direction of the wind, and every spark that landed on their side of the break had to be found and killed before it became its own fire. This was the work now. Not digging. The digging was done. Now it was watching and moving and stamping out the spot fires before they caught, and the four of them spread out along the break and did exactly that for the next hour and a half. She lost count of the spot fires she found and killed. There was a particular smell to grass that is just caught, different from the larger fire smell, a sharper green smoke smell, and she learned to move toward it before she saw it. She burned the back of her right hand on one she got to too slowly, a flash that was gone before she registered it, but left a mark she wouldn't fully assess until much later. She didn't stop to assess it then. At one point, she turned and found Silas right behind her, stamping out something she'd walked past. His face was dark with smoke, and his coat had a burned patch along one sleeve. He looked at her without saying anything, a quick checking look, and she gave him a small nod that meant she was still functioning, and he moved on. This was what she would remember most afterward. Not the fire or the line or the smoke. The nod, the fact that they'd developed somewhere in the previous 6 weeks a shared language compact enough to fit in a single movement. The fire died against the break at 2 in the afternoon. It didn't end dramatically. It thinned on the far side of the break where the fuel had burned down to nothing, and the wind dropped slightly as the afternoon progressed, and gradually the roar that had been the background of the last 2 hours became a crackle, and then an intermittent sound and then silence. And the silence was so complete after everything that preceded it that she stood in it for a moment without moving. Silas was standing 30 feet to her left. He was looking at the far side of the break, at the blackened ground that stretched south of them in every direction, still smoking, still hot, a landscape that had been prairie this morning and was now something else entirely. The barn was standing, the house was standing. The kitchen garden Rose had put to bed in November, now under an inch of hard frost, was untouched. Everything on their side of the break was where it had been at 6 that morning. Danny sat down on the ground without ceremony and looked at the sky. Hector stood with his arms at his sides and breathed. She walked to the edge of the break and stood with her boots at the line of bare earth and looked at the burn. The smell was tremendous. Not unpleasant exactly, but total, the way certain smells occupy every other sense as well. Hot earth and ash and the particular metallic quality of a fire that has burned hot and long. She heard Silas walk up beside her. They stood there for a moment without speaking. She was aware of how close he was standing, not crowding, just close, in the way of people who have spent the last few hours occupying the same high-stakes space and haven't yet decompressed back to ordinary distances. The north pasture grass didn't catch, he said. No, she said. The Hendersons lost their south barn in this same fire, I'd guess. Wind would have pushed it that direction first. Yes, she paused. Do you know them well, the Hendersons? Well enough. Margaret will know what to do. She'll organize something. She almost smiled at that because Margaret Vance organizing something was not in doubt. She filed it away. The Hendersons would need help, and she would talk to Margaret when she got back. She looked down at her hands. The blister on her right palm had opened and the burn on the back of her hand was visible now, a stripe of angry red against the gray-brown of ash and dirt. Silas looked down at it too. He said nothing for a moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, not in the way of impulse or romance, but in the specific careful way of someone examining an injury, turning it slightly to see the extent of it. His own hands were in similar condition. The left had a cut she'd noticed earlier, reopened, and there were small burns along the forearm where the sleeve had ridden up. We need to see to these, she said. Yes, he said. He didn't release her hand right away. He looked at it, at the burn, at the opened blister, at the dirt worked into every line of her palm, and his face had an expression she had no framework for, something that combined practical concern with something else she couldn't categorize. She looked at his face, and he was looking at her hand, and for a moment the afternoon was entirely still around them. Then Danny said, from where he was still sitting on the ground, "Are we going to get the children?" And the moment folded back into ordinary time. Silas released her hand. "Yes," he said. "Get up, Danny." Danny got up with the theatrical suffering of someone who is 19 and has just done adult work for 6 hours, and they walked back toward the house. Yes. The children returned at dusk, Margaret driving the wagon with Noah and Rose beside her, and Ben asleep in Rose's arms, with the total unconsciousness of a 2-year-old who decided the crisis was over and went to sleep. Noah's face when he saw the house standing and the barn standing was something Evelyn carried with her after, the specific quality of a child's relief, which is different from adult relief because children have not yet learned to make it dignified. He jumped from the wagon before it fully stopped and ran to her, and she caught him with both arms and held on, and he held on back, and neither of them said anything for a minute because there was too much to say, and none of it needed to be said right now. Rose came up behind him with Ben still in her arms. She'd managed to keep him asleep through the transition from the wagon, and leaned against Evelyn's side. And Evelyn put her arm around her daughter, and the four of them stood together in the ash-smelling air while the last of the evening light came off the unburned prairie to the north. She felt Silas nearby. She didn't look, but she felt him. That evening was different from all the evenings before it. There was a quality to the house that was different, not from any physical change, but from the weight of what had happened, which sat in the rooms like a tangible thing. People moved through it more quietly than usual. Even Ben, who had woken up hungry and confused and needed feeding, subsided quickly into the sleepy docility of a child in a household that is organizing itself around something larger than his comprehension. She put the children to bed and came down to tend the burns and cuts that the whole crew had accumulated during the day. She did Hector first. He had a burn along his right forearm that needed proper dressing, and Margaret helped hold the lamp, and they worked in the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of people who have used their words up for the day. Danny, who had a blister on both palms and a sore pride from having sat down on the ground in front of everyone, submitted to treatment with more grace than she'd expected, and said, "Thank you, ma'am," with such genuine feeling that she suspected it was the first time he'd said those words to a woman who wasn't his mother. Silas came last, as she'd expected. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and put his hands flat on the surface in a way that made the available injuries visible without comment, and she worked through them with the same matter-of-fact attention she'd given the others. The kitchen was quiet. Margaret and Hector had gone to the bunkhouse. Danny had gone to bed. The fire was down to coals. Outside, the wind had died entirely, and the night was clear and cold and still. She was cleaning the cut on his left palm, the same one from the storm, reopened, and she was aware of the silence between them as a different kind of thing than it had been. 6 weeks of shared silence had given her a reasonably good sense of what his different silences meant. This one had a quality she hadn't cataloged yet. "I watched you today," he said. She kept her attention on his hand. "I imagine you watched everyone today." "Not like that." A pause. "You weren't afraid." "I was afraid," she said. "I was frightened all morning. I was frightened when I put Noah on that wagon." "That's not what I meant." He paused, seeming to search for the word. "You didn't let it make your decisions for you." She considered this. "Fear is information," she said, "same as anything else. You use it to figure out what matters, and then you do what needs doing." He was quiet. "My mother used to say that," she said, before she'd decided to say it. "She was a practical woman." "She sounds like it." She was. She was also frightening sometimes, in the way that very capable people are frightening when you're small and you haven't figured out yet whether you have any of the same in you. She tied off the bandage and released his hand and looked up. "I spent most of my life trying to figure that out." He looked at her across the table. The coal light from the fireplace caught the side of his face, and the burn on his forearm, and the exhaustion in his eyes, and also something else, something that had been there before today, but that today had made impossible to pretend wasn't. "I don't want to be careless," he said, carefully, as though the words had been considered and reconfigured several times before arriving in that order. She understood what he meant. She understood it completely, because she'd been holding the same weight. "I know," she said. "You have 3 children, and you've—" He stopped, looked at his bandaged hand. "I know what you've been through." "You don't know all of it," she said, "but you know enough." He looked up. "I'm not made of glass," she said. It came out quieter than she'd intended. I don't need to be handled with— I'm not going to break, Silas." He looked at her for a long time. The fire made a small settling sound behind her. "I know that," he said finally. "That's not what I'm afraid of." She looked at him. Then what are you afraid of? He seemed to consider whether to answer in the way of someone who hasn't gotten into the habit of answering this type of question. That I'll give you something else to carry, he said. You've got enough already. She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind found its way back through the gap in the east window frame, and the coal light shifted slightly and settled. That's not your decision to make, she said. He looked at her. What I carry and what I don't, she said. That's not your decision. The silence between them had changed again, into something that occupied more space than silence usually did. She stood up, which was not because she wanted to leave, but because she needed to move before she said something she wasn't ready to say yet. She began putting away the medical supplies with the same systematic attention she applied to everything, and she heard him push back his chair. Evelyn, he said. She turned. He was standing now, and the kitchen was very quiet, and he had the expression of a man who has something to say and has decided to say it even though the saying of it requires stepping off something solid. But he stopped. She saw him stop, saw the moment where the thing that was about to be said got folded back. He looked away, then back. Then, get some sleep, he said. You need it. It wasn't what he'd started to say. They both knew that. She held his gaze for a moment and then nodded once. Good night, she said. She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the dark and listened to the sounds of the house settling and the fire dying downstairs, and the wind outside moving over a prairie that was half ash now and half winter grass. She put her hand over her own chest just for a moment, not dramatically, not the gesture of a woman in a story, but the practical check of someone making sure the thing inside is still there, still organized, still reliable. It was. Beating harder than usual, maybe, but there. She lay down and did not sleep for some time, and when she finally did, the dream she had was not of Thomas, which had been the shape of her night since October. The morning after a fire has its own particular quality. The air smells of it. The light looks different over burned ground, flatter somehow, as though the fire has taken some dimension out of the landscape along with the grass. She was up before the others and had breakfast going when Silas came down. He poured his coffee and stood at the window looking south at the blackened line visible on the horizon, where the burn ended and the unburned country began. I want to ride out and see the Hendersons today, he said. Find out what they need. Margaret will have already organized something, she said. Probably. He didn't turn from the window. I want to go anyway. I'll have something ready to send with you, food and supplies. He turned then and looked at her, and the morning light was the flat post-fire light, and he looked tired in it, the way people look honest when they haven't slept enough. Thank you, he said. She looked at him. She thought about what he'd said last night, about not wanting to give her something else to carry. And she thought about the fact that this man had paid $437 to stop her children from being sold, and had asked nothing for it except work she was glad to give, and had spent 6 weeks being careful with her in the way of someone who has something to be careful about. She thought about all of this, and said nothing about any of it. She put bacon in the skillet, and the kitchen filled with that sound and that smell, and outside the burned prairie lay flat and cold under a sky that was going to be clear. Some things were going to have to be said eventually. She knew that. He knew it too. But the morning was asking for breakfast, and the Hendersons needed help, and there were 3 children about to come down the stairs, and for now, this was enough. She cooked. He drank his coffee. The fire in the stove crackled steadily between them, doing what fires do when they're contained and managed and given the right fuel. Throwing heat, throwing light, making the cold outside bearable. The Hendersons had lost their south barn, 2 months of stored feed, and a draft horse named Luther who had been with the family for 11 years, and whose absence Evelyn could see when they rode out that first afternoon, was felt as something closer to grief than property loss. Ray Henderson was a man in his 50s with large hands and the squinting quality of someone who has spent decades reading weather. And he stood in the yard looking at the black ground where his barn had been, with the expression of a person trying to locate themselves in a situation that doesn't have the shape they expected their life to have. Margaret had indeed already organized something. By the time Silas and Evelyn arrived with the wagon loaded with 2 weeks of food supplies and extra blankets, Margaret had established a kind of informal relief coordination with 3 other ranching families in the area, working through the same network of necessity and mutual dependence that held frontier communities together when institutions failed, which was more often than institutions like to admit. Evelyn helped unload, and she helped Addie Henderson, Ray's wife, a sharp-eyed woman of about 40 with flour on her apron and the particular efficiency of someone running on anger because grief is too slow, organized what had come in and what still needed to come. They worked in Addie's kitchen for 2 hours, and Evelyn left with a clear sense of what the Hendersons actually needed versus what people had assumed they needed, which were two different lists, and she wrote up the correct list that evening and gave it to Silas so he could take it to the organizing effort that Margaret was running. He read the list and looked at her. "How did you get Addie Henderson to tell you all this?" I asked her. "Ray hasn't told me half of what's on this list, and I've known him 12 years. Ray is managing his pride," she said. "Addie is managing the situation. They're different tasks." She paused. "Also, I told her about the auction, about October." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because she needed to know I wasn't there to feel sorry for her," Evelyn said. "People don't want your sympathy when they're trying to get back on their feet. They want to know you understand the ground." She picked up her pen and went back to the correspondence she'd been drafting. "She'll be all right. She's angry, which is useful." Silas stood there a moment with the list in his hand, looking at her, and she was aware of the look without meeting it, because she was fairly certain that meeting it right now would lead somewhere she wasn't ready to navigate in the middle of a correspondence session. "I'll take this to Margaret," he said, finally. "She'll have already thought of most of it," Evelyn said, "but not the lumber." He left. She kept writing. February arrived with a cold that had a different quality from the cold before the fire. Drier, thinner, the kind of cold that doesn't bother to be dramatic because it knows it has the stamina to outlast whatever you're doing. The ranch contracted into its winter routines with the particular discipline of people who have been tested and know now what they can withstand. The burned ground to the south was useful in one specific way. It had removed the fuel that might have carried a second fire should one start further out. Silas said this to Hector one morning, standing at the fence line and looking at the black expanse, and Hector had said that it was one way to look at it, and Silas had said it was the practical way. And Hector had made a sound that might have been agreement or might have been something more complicated. Evelyn had finished the full year's accounts by the first week of February. She laid them out on the desk in the front room on a Tuesday evening and went through them with Silas the way she'd been going through the accounts with him for 3 months now. Sitting across from each other, her explaining the figures and their implications, him asking the genuinely good questions he'd always asked once he'd gotten past the defensiveness that most men had about being taught something by a woman. The ranch was profitable, more profitable than the previous year by a margin that surprised him, until she showed him where the improvements had come from. The corrected supply arrangements, the recovered Callaway labor, the better tracking of feed costs that had let him make smarter purchasing decisions in the fall. He sat with the final numbers for a while. She let him. "This is more than I expected," he said. "It's what was already there," she said. "It just needed watching." He looked at her across the desk. "It needed you watching it," he said. "There's a difference." She didn't argue with that because it was true, and arguing with true things was a waste of time she'd eliminated from her habits years ago. "I want to adjust your wage," he said. She looked up. "My wage is fair." "Your wage was set when I thought I was hiring a housekeeper." He said it without defensiveness, just the flat statement of a man correcting an error. "You're running the business side of this operation. That's worth more than what I'm paying you." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the flour sacks and the carpet bag she'd arrived with in October. She thought about what it meant to be able to accumulate something that was purely hers, not Thomas's, not an arrangement, but money she'd earned that belonged to her and her children and could not be touched by a creditor or an administrator or a court. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He nodded and looked back at the accounts, and she looked back at hers. And that was the whole of it. Efficient, direct, no theater. Which was, she thought, one of the things she'd come to genuinely value about the way he operated. The accident happened on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of February, which was the kind of detail that fixes itself in memory because it was an ordinary Thursday with nothing to warn you. Danny had been working a new colt, a young animal they'd taken in on a trade with the Pearsons east of town, dark-coated and skittish in the way of horses that have been handled inconsistently and haven't yet decided whether people were worth trusting. Danny had been patient with him, more patient than she'd expected when she first watched them together, and the work had been going well. She was in the kitchen garden. She'd been surveying the beds that Rose had put to bed in the fall, planning the spring planting, making notes. When she heard the sound, she would not have been able to describe it adequately afterward, a thud that was too heavy and too specific to be ordinary ranch noise, followed by a silence, and then Danny's voice at a pitch she'd never heard from him before. She was moving before she'd made the decision to move. She came around the corner of the barn and took in the situation in pieces, the way she'd learned to do with emergencies. Danny was on the ground on his back, one leg at an angle that was immediately and obviously wrong. The colt was at the far end of the corral, pressed into the corner, trembling. The fence rail that Danny had been using as a mounting point had given way. She could see the split wood, and the fall had been sideways and bad. Hector was already at Danny's side, kneeling, with the frozen expression of a man confronted with an injury outside his competence. She went through the corral gate and crossed the space and got down beside Danny, and the first thing she did was put her hand on his sternum, not for sentiment, but to feel his breathing, whether it was even and functional or labored or absent. It was fast and shallow, which meant pain and shock, but it was there, regular. His airway was clear. "Danny," she said. His eyes were open and on her. "Look at me. Stay with me." "My leg," he said, in a voice that wasn't his ordinary voice. "I know, I see it." She moved her attention to the leg. The angle said fracture. The question was where and how bad. She ran her hands along his thigh carefully, watching his face for the specific response to pressure that would tell her what she needed to know. He gasped when she reached the mid-femur. "Is it bad?" he said. "Yes," she said, because lying to him about what his own leg felt like would have been insulting and useless. "Am I going to lose it?" "I don't know yet. Hold still." She became aware of Silas behind her. She didn't turn. She kept her hands and her attention where they were. But she said, "I need 2 straight boards, as long as my arm, and everything in the medical box and all the clean cloth in the house. Clean, not just dry, and whiskey." "Do you have whiskey?" "Yes." "Get all of it." She heard him leave at a run, which was the first time she'd ever heard Silas Boone run anywhere, and then she turned her full attention back to Danny. "This is going to hurt," she said. "I'm sorry about that in advance." "You've done this before?" His voice had the careful quality of someone managing terror by finding things to hold on to. "My mother's oldest brother was a field surgeon in the war," she said, keeping her voice even and her hands moving in the methodical assessment pattern she'd watched so many times as a child, when men had come to her uncle's practice and she'd been allowed to observe because she was quiet and didn't look away. "I helped him in his practice during 2 summers when I was 14 and 15. How long ago was that?" 15 years. She looked at him directly. "I haven't forgotten it." He made a sound that was trying to be a laugh and didn't quite make it. "That's reassuring and not reassuring at the same time." "I know. Try to keep breathing the way you're breathing." Silas came back. He had the boards, good straight cedar lengths from the equipment shed, and the medical box, and Margaret right behind him with her arms full of cloth that she'd clearly pulled from multiple sources, including, Evelyn noted, her own good linen. Margaret took one look at the situation, assessed it with the specific rapid competence of someone who has dealt with ranch injuries before, and said, "What do you need?" "Hold his shoulders," Evelyn said. "Don't let him come up. Hector, I need you on his hips. Same. Don't let him move." She set the leg. She did it correctly, the way her uncle had taught her. With speed because drawn out was crueler. With steadiness because hands that shook made things worse. And with the full understanding that what she was doing was going to cause serious pain to a 19-year-old boy who had not done anything to deserve serious pain except fall off a fence rail on an ordinary Thursday. Danny made a sound she would not describe to anyone afterward. Then he went quiet with the effortful silence of someone concentrating everything they have on not making that sound again. She got the boards alongside the leg, and she and Margaret bound it together with the efficiency of two women who have between them enough practical experience to manage a crisis without narrating it. And when it was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at Danny's face, pale, sweating, eyes closed, and checked his breathing again. Still there. Even. He was going to keep the leg if he didn't get infection, and she was going to spend the next week making sure he didn't get infection. "He needs a doctor," she said to Silas. "Nearest one is 12 miles, I know, but he needs to be seen properly in the next few days, and in the meantime, I'll manage what I can." She stood up. "We need to get him inside, carefully." "I heard that," Danny said, without opening his eyes. "Carefully." "Don't be smart, you're concussed," she said. "I'm not concussed." "You fell off a fence rail and hit your head. You're concussed." She looked at Silas and Hector. "Carefully." They carried him in, all four of them, Margaret directing with the authority of someone who had clearly moved injured people before, and got him onto the bed in the downstairs room that had been a storage room until Evelyn reorganized it in November. She'd kept it clear since then for no specific reason, out of the general principle of maintaining functional space, and she was grateful for that now. She spent the next 4 hours with Danny, and she was grimly honest with herself the entire time about what she knew and what she didn't know, and what she was guessing at based on 15-year-old memory, and the difference between those three things mattered enormously. She cleaned the wound at the break site, which had torn through. She monitored his consciousness with the periodic checks her uncle had shown her. Specific questions, specific responses to watch for, the signs that meant the head injury was manageable, and the signs that meant it wasn't. She got fluids into him, and she managed his pain with the whiskey and the laudanum she found in the back of the medical box. Silas rode to Caldwell Crossing for the doctor that afternoon and came back with him the following morning. And the doctor, a young man named Whitfield, who had the careful manner of someone still learning to be confident, examined Danny and examined Evelyn's work, and then looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately place. "Who set this?" he said. "I did," she said. He looked at the binding, the alignment, the condition of the wound site. "You've done this before." "I've seen it done correctly. I tried to replicate what I saw." He looked at her for another moment, then back at his patient. "It's as well said as I could have done it," he said. The statement seemed to cost him something, though she suspected it would have cost him more a year ago. "He's going to have a long recovery, but if you keep the wound clean and watch for fever, I know what to watch for," she said. He looked at her again with that unplaceable expression and then said, in the tone of a man deciding something, "Yes, I believe you do." Wyatt. Word traveled the way word travels on the frontier, Barsum. Not through any single channel, but through the aggregate motion of people who carry information the way they carry supplies, as a matter of routine commerce. By the end of that week, the story of what Evelyn had done for Danny had reached every ranch within 15 miles and several in town. She was aware of this in the way you become aware of weather, not because anyone announced it, but because the atmosphere changed. People who had known about her in the abstract, as the widow Silas Boone had collected from the auction in October, began to know about her in a different way. Addie Henderson sent a note that said simply, "I heard about the Pearson boy. Well done." 3 women from town came to call on different days in the following 2 weeks, and their manner was different from Clara Finch's manner. They were not delivering a verdict, they were introducing themselves, which was a different transaction entirely. She was not naive about this. She understood that her status in the community had shifted because she'd done something that the community recognized as valuable, and that this was both fair and somewhat insufficient as a basis for belonging. She didn't say this to anyone. She accepted the introductions with the same practical courtesy she applied to everything and waited to see what developed. What developed, over the weeks that followed, was something slower and more real than approval. It was the specific kind of recognition that comes from people deciding that you are someone they want to be in the same county with when things go wrong. The kind of recognition that is built from individual observations rather than collective judgment. It wasn't effusive and it wasn't complete. There were still people in Caldwell Crossing who held the original verdict, the one from October, the widow with debts verdict. But it was real, and real was enough. Danny recovered. It was slow, and it was not comfortable. He was not a patient, which was perhaps predictable for someone who was 19 and used to spending his days in motion. And he went through a period of approximately 2 weeks where his disposition was genuinely unpleasant, which Evelyn managed with the same even-handed firmness she applied to Noah when Noah was pushing the limits of what his patience could hold. "You are not going to die," she told Danny on one of the more difficult afternoons. "You're going to be annoyed for another 6 weeks, and then you are going to walk out of this room and get back on a horse and probably do something equally stupid." "I didn't do something stupid," he said with feeling. "The rail was cracked. I saw it 3 days ago." He stared at her. "You saw it and didn't—" "I mentioned it to Hector, who mentioned it to you, who apparently did not internalize it." She straightened his blanket with a motion that was brisk rather than gentle. "So yes, something stupid." He was quiet for a moment, working with this. "You mentioned it to Hector?" "Yes." Another pause. "I don't remember him telling me." "That I can't speak to." He looked at the ceiling. He had the expression of a young man processing the fact that he'd been given information that might have prevented his current suffering and had let it pass through him without sticking, which was a particular kind of frustrating to reckon with. "How long have I been in this bed?" he said. 11 days. Feels like longer. Most things that confine you feel longer than they are." She picked up the empty water cup. "You'll be on crutches in a week if you stop fighting the rest." He looked at her. "You're not very soft about it," he said. "Do you want soft?" He thought about it. "No," he said, in the honest tone of someone who has just examined a preference and found it to be something other than they expected. "I guess I don't." She went to refill his water, and he called after her. "Mrs. Mercer." She turned. "Hector told me," he said, "what you did when I first came down. The way you just went ahead and did what needed doing without—" He stopped. "I don't know if I said thank you." "You said it 3 times in the first day," she said. "You were concussed, so I'm not holding you to the count." "Still," he said. "You're welcome, Danny," she said, and went to get the water. It was Hector who said it to her directly. About 3 weeks after the accident, on an afternoon when they were both working in the barn, she checking inventory, he repairing a halter, in the companionable quiet of people who have been through enough together that shared space doesn't require maintenance. "You know," he said, without looking up from the halter, "when Silas first brought you all out here, I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought it was going to end badly. For everyone." She kept her attention on the inventory. "I know. It wasn't about you specifically. It was more that I didn't see how it worked. A widow with 3 children and a man who's lived alone since I've known him." He paused. "I've known him 8 years." "I know. He's a good man," Hector said. He doesn't say much about what's in him, but he's a good man." She looked at him then because his tone had shifted into something that was trying to tell her something specific. He was looking at her now, too. His face had the quality of a man who has decided to say a thing that is not his business to say, but that he's going to say anyway, because someone has to. "He came back from the Henderson place the day after the fire," Hector said, "and the first thing he did was check on your children, before the horses, before the structure damage, before anything." A pause. "I've worked for this man for 8 years. That's not— He doesn't do things in that order normally." She held his gaze for a moment. "I'm not telling you what to do," Hector said quickly, in the tone of a man who has realized he may have overstepped. "It's not my—" "Hector," she said. He stopped. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her for another moment, something settling in his face, and then he looked back at the halter and went back to work. She went back to her inventory. She made herself finish the full count before she put the notebook down and stood for a moment in the quiet of the barn, with the horses moving in their stalls and the February light coming in thin through the boards. The conversation she'd been not having with Silas had been accumulating the way certain kinds of weather accumulate, not dramatically, not with the obvious machinery of an approaching storm, but with the slow pressure of something that has been building in the background of every other thing. She had been thinking about what Hector said. She had been thinking about the moment after the fire when Silas had held her burned hand and said, "I don't want to give you something else to carry." She had been thinking about the kitchen table in December, the accounts, the hour of his company that she'd begun to feel, with the specific discomfort of a woman who knows herself well as the best hour of most days. She'd been thinking about Thomas, not with grief exactly, or not only with grief. She'd moved through the sharpest geography of that and was in the longer, lower country now, the place where grief becomes part of the landscape rather than the landscape itself. She thought about what Thomas would have said. He'd been a practical man in some ways and a romantic in others, a combination she'd found exasperating and essential in roughly equal measure. And she thought he would have said, she was fairly certain he would have said, that she was overthinking it, which was his standard diagnosis for most things she did with her mind, and that she should stop doing that and figure out what she actually wanted. What she actually wanted was something she'd been managing not to examine directly, because looking at it directly required admitting that it existed. She wanted Silas, not the arrangement, not the security, not the practical consolidation of two people's situations into something more stable. Though all of those things were real, and she wouldn't pretend they weren't. She wanted him specifically, the way he thought. The way he moved through the world with that self-contained steadiness that wasn't coldness but was something closer to a deep-seated refusal to be rushed by things that didn't deserve the urgency. The way he'd looked at Noah's hands on the auction platform and made a decision in 30 seconds that had changed everything. The way he'd held Ben so carefully that night in the chair, barely touching, as if gentleness was something he hadn't had much practice with and was being very careful not to do wrong. That was the thing. He was careful. He was careful in the way of someone who has been careless before, or has watched carelessness do damage, and has reorganized himself around the intention not to repeat it. She recognized this because she'd done the same thing. She went looking for him on a Saturday evening in early March. He wasn't in the barn or the equipment shed, which meant he was in the north pasture, which is where she found him, standing at the fence line in the cold, looking at the cattle in the way he sometimes did when he was thinking through something. He heard her approach and turned. "I want to say something," she said. She stopped about 6 feet from him, which seemed like the right distance, close enough to be talking honestly, far enough not to crowd a situation that was already complicated. "And I'd like you to not say anything until I'm finished." He looked at her. The last of the day's light was going behind the western hills, and it was cold enough that her breath made a small cloud when she spoke. "I know what I said in October, about keeping things practical, and I still mean that. I meant every word of it." She paused. "But I've been watching you for 5 months, and you've been watching me. And I think we're both aware that what we've been watching is not strictly professional." He said nothing. He'd promised not to, and he kept the promise. "I am not made of glass," she said, which was what she'd told him before, because it was still true, and still the central thing. "I have been through loss, and I know what it costs, and I am not. I am not someone who will commit lightly to anything. You know that about me by now." She held his gaze. "But I would rather have a hard conversation than spend another 6 months pretending the conversation isn't necessary." The silence stretched out for a moment. "I'm done," she said. He moved then. Not toward her, not yet. But the stillness he'd been holding shifted into something else, something that she read, after 5 months of learning to read him, as relief. The specific relief of a man who has been waiting to be given permission to stop being so careful. "I don't know how to do this well," he said. His voice was different than usual. Not lower, just more direct, stripped of the usual practical distance. I've kept myself. I don't have a lot of experience with saying what I mean about." He stopped, tried again. "I'm not good at it." "I know," she said. "I've noticed." She paused. "I don't need you to be good at it. I need you to try." He looked at her for a long moment. The cold was settling in earnest now, the blue dark of a prairie evening coming on, and the cattle were moving in the background with their slow, peaceful shifting. "I think about the auction," he said. "About what would have happened if I'd—" He stopped. "I almost didn't go into town that day. I nearly sent Danny instead." He looked away briefly and then back. "I think about that." "So do I," she said. "I don't regret it," he said, which she knew, which he'd told her before, but which apparently still needed saying. "I want you to know that. I don't regret any of it. Not the money, not the arrangement, not... He looked at the fence, then back at her. Not any of it. I know, she said. I'm not saying it to make you feel obligated. Silas. She said his name the way she sometimes said Noah's, when he was going in a direction that needed to be stopped and redirected. I know. I came out here, remember? I started this conversation. Something in his face went quiet, in a different way. The specific quiet of a man who has been carrying something and has just been told he can put it down. I'd like to... He stopped, started over. I don't know the right way to ask this. The flat directness of his ordinary speech had gone slightly unsteady at the edges, which she found, against her expectations, not alarming but simply true. The human unevenness of a man being honest about something that mattered to him. I want to build something with you, if that's something you'd want, not because of the arrangement, not because it's practical. He paused. Because it's you, specifically. The last light went behind the hills. The first star was faint and far above the southern line. She looked at him standing there in the cold. This man who had walked out of the back of a crowd and changed her children's lives with 30 words in a leather pouch, who had sat at the kitchen table and learned accounts she taught him, and asked good questions and held her son's gaze across a supper table and carried Ben so carefully in the firelight. And she thought about what it meant to choose something when you knew the cost of loss, when you were not innocent of what commitment could leave you holding if it ended. She thought about what she'd told Hector without knowing she was telling herself. That being angry was useful, that it meant you were still moving. Yes, she said. The word was small in the cold air, but he heard it. He took the 3 steps that closed the space between them, and he reached out and put his hand against the side of her face. The burned hand. The one that had the marks from the fire, carefully, the way he'd held Ben, with the specific gentleness of someone who has not had much practice with it and is being exact. And she put her hand over his, and they stood there in the gathering dark, with the cold around them, and the cattle moving in the background, and the first stars coming out overhead. She was 31 years old, and she had been through enough to know that this was not a solution. It was a beginning. Beginnings were hard and imprecise, and frequently went sideways and required the constant maintenance of 2 people's willingness to stay in them. She knew that. She was choosing it anyway. He lowered his hand. She lowered hers. The children, he said. Yes, she said. Noah watches everything, she said. He's probably already figured it out. Something crossed his face that was close to a smile. And Rose? Rose will want to be consulted. Ben, he said, already calls me Cy. I know, she said. He decided that in November. He doesn't go back on his decisions. There was a pause. Then very quietly, he laughed. A real laugh, not the territory of it, but the actual thing, brief and slightly rusty, as if it had not been used in a while. And she heard it and felt it settle somewhere in her and did not try to name what that meant because she didn't need to name everything. Come inside, she said. It's cold. Yes, he said. They walked back to the house together in the dark. Not touching, but close. The space between them different from any space that had existed before, and the lights of the house came up ahead of them through the cold, clear air. And inside those lights were her children, asleep or nearly, and the life that had assembled itself around her in the 5 months since the worst morning of her life. The door opened. The warmth came out to meet them. She told the children on a Sunday. She'd thought about how to do it for 2 weeks, not because she was uncertain, but because Noah was 8 now and deserved to understand rather than simply be informed, and Rose was 7 and would require consultation, and Ben was 2.5 and had already made his own arrangements in November and considered the matter settled. She sat them at the kitchen table with the remains of dinner still on it, because difficult conversations went better when the atmosphere was ordinary rather than ceremonially arranged. I want to talk to you about Mr. Silas, she said. He's asked me to marry him, and I've said yes. But I wanted to tell you before anything is decided because this is your life too. Rose put down her cornbread. Are we going to stay here? Yes. This would be our home. Permanently. Rose nodded once with the focused deliberateness she brought to all significant decisions and picked her cornbread back up. That was apparently sufficient for Rose. Noah had not moved. He was looking at the table. "Noah," she said. "I know," he said. "What do you know?" He looked up. "I saw how you were different after the fire. With him." He paused. "He's not Papa." "No," she said. "He's not. He's not trying to be either. I've noticed that." Another pause. "He checks on the horses every night before he goes to bed, even when it's cold. Papa never did that. Papa forgot things, and then he was sorry." He looked at the table. "Silas doesn't forget things." She sat with that. Thomas had been careless in specific ways. The ways of a man who meant everything and followed through on some of it and relied on other people's patience for the rest. Her children had seen what they had seen, and Noah's accounting was honest, and she wasn't going to contest it. "No," she said. "He doesn't." "Okay," Noah said. "That's it?" He looked at her with the expression that was going to be devastating when he was 30. "I think you've been sad for a long time," he said slowly, "and you're less sad now." A pause. "I think that's good. That's—" She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his palm up and held on, and they sat like that while Rose ate her cornbread and Ben knocked a cup off the edge of the table and watched it fall with the satisfied curiosity of a child studying physics. They were married on the first Saturday in April, when the prairie had started its slow return to green and Rose's kitchen garden was already showing the first determined shoots in the beds she'd turned and planted in late March. It was not a large wedding. They'd signed the county documents on the Friday before, which was the legal substance of it. The Saturday gathering at the ranch was simply the acknowledgement among the people whose acknowledgement meant something. Hector and Margaret, Danny on crutches but moving with improving confidence, Addie and Ray Henderson, two women from town who had called after Danny's accident, and the Burke family from the north with their 3 children and a canned ham of extraordinary quality. Evelyn wore her best dark blue wool dress. Rose had put a ribbon in her hair with the focused solemnity of a craftsperson executing important work. Silas stood beside her in a clean shirt and his best coat, wearing the slightly uncomfortable expression of a man who has agreed to be the center of attention and is managing it through willpower. He'd combed his hair. She noticed and did not comment. There was no ceremony to speak of. Hector said someone should say something, and Silas looked at Evelyn, and she looked at him. And then she said, in the plain, direct way she said things that mattered, "We're going to work hard and be honest and try not to waste what we have." She looked at the people in the yard. "That's what I've got." Addie Henderson said, "That'll do," in the tone of a woman who has seen enough frontier marriages to know that the ones that hold are built on exactly that and nothing more romantic, and that was the whole of it. The months that followed were not easy, the way stories sometimes make things easy once the central difficulty is resolved. There was a fence line dispute with a neighboring rancher in May that Evelyn settled with a property survey she'd requested from the county office in January, because no one had thought to ask for it, and she had. Danny left for Colorado in the spring with a horse Silas sold him fairly and a letter of character Evelyn wrote in her clear, direct prose, which Danny folded carefully and put in the inside pocket of his coat. He shook Silas's hand and hugged Margaret, and then stood in front of Evelyn with the slightly overwhelmed quality of a young man who has run out of his prepared words. "Right when you get there," she said. "Yes, ma'am. And check your fence rails." He laughed, the clean, unguarded laugh of someone who no longer has to protect himself from the joke, and rode west. Noah watched him go from the fence. Then he climbed down and went to check on pockets, which was what he did when he had feelings he was still learning to process. In October, Silas put Evelyn's name on the deed. Equal ownership, proper legal language, handled by a lawyer in Wichita rather than just the clerk, because she'd told him to do it correctly, and he had. She held the document for a moment when it came back. She thought about Gerald Pratt and his ledger and his legal opinion. She thought about the 3 appointments and the papers pushed back across the desk. She thought about what it meant to have your name on something that could not be taken by a creditor or an administrator or a man with a red vest and a cheerful disposition toward other people's suffering. She filed it in the correspondence folder and went back to the accounts. There is something nobody tells you about the kind of survival that requires you to make choices about who you want to become on the other side of what you've been through. They don't tell you it isn't a moment. There is no specific morning when you wake up changed. It is instead a long accumulation of ordinary days, cooking and accounts and cold mornings and children's arguments and the exhaustion of work that matters. Until one day you look around and realize you are not surviving your life anymore. You are living it. Evelyn Mercer had stood on an auction platform while a man in a red vest put a price on her family. She had held herself together, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had 3 children whose faces she could not afford to look into with terror on her own face. She was not that woman anymore. Not because that woman had been insufficient, she had been entirely sufficient, but because that woman had not yet had the chance to become this one. On a Saturday in late spring, she stood at the edge of the kitchen garden while the morning light was still new, the dew still on the grass. Rose was already crouched between 2 beds with a trowel and an expression of focused satisfaction. Noah was in the barn with pockets. Ben was somewhere in the house, talking to himself with the elaborate narrative quality of a 3-year-old whose interior world is extremely populated. She heard Silas's boots on the step, and then he was beside her, in the way he was always simply there. No announcement, no performance, just his presence, which she had come to know as well as she knew her own. They stood together, looking at the garden and the prairie and the morning. "Rose is going to oversaw the east bed again," he said. "I know. I've told her. She doesn't listen. She listens. She just disagrees." A pause. "She's usually right." He made the sound that was his version of a laugh. Ben appeared in the doorway trailing a blanket, looking for his mother with the focused navigation of a child who needs to locate the center of his world before the day can begin. She turned and picked him up. Heavy now, solid, not the bird-boned infant she'd balanced on her hip at the auction, and he settled against her with the complete satisfaction of someone who has found what he was looking for. "See," he said, looking over her shoulder. "Hey, Ben," Silas said, the same voice he'd used that first night in the front room. The voice of a man holding something he wants to get right. She had arrived here with 2 flour sacks and a carpet bag and 3 children and the knowledge that she was going to have to make something out of whatever she was handed. The thing she'd learned, not from a single moment but from the long accumulation of all of them, was that your worth is not determined by who has the power to assign it. Not the administrator, not the crowd, not the woman with the preserves and the opinions. You build it daily, through the quality of your presence and the honesty of your effort, and the willingness to stay in the room when the room gets hard. No one gives it to you. No one can take it away. She stood in the spring morning with her son on her hip and her husband beside her and her daughter in the garden, making her own decisions with a trowel, and she was not happy in the simple, uncomplicated way of someone who hasn't been tested. She was happy in the harder, more durable way of someone who knows exactly what it cost and has decided it was worth it. That was enough. She had learned, over the long months since that October morning, that enough was not a small thing. It was, in fact, everything.